Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. Our world is seeing a lot of things happen. And what is happening in the Middle East, especially in Gaza between Palestine and Israel, is still to be decided by the international courts if it is justified. And, hey, Israel is acting out of protection. Or if they're acting out of revenge, which it's going to need to be curbed, and there will be a consequence to purely acting out of revenge. Their agricultural system is failing, as you're going to hear in one of the segments today, that the children that reside in this area of the world are the highest risk for malnutrition, deadly diseases, and health risks. Health risks, kind of tying a bow on it. That the likelihood of a child surviving through their entire childhood to be a teenager or into their 20s is falling off. That the odds are against the survival of these children. Of course, that also leads back to the idea, is that leading towards the idea of revenge and genocide on Israel's part. So there's a lot of thoughts going on with that. But to get back to here at home in Canada, that we're going to hear some statements about housing, again about the economy here, and economy around the world at this point in our 21st century as human beings is very interconnected. What happens in one area of the world has an effect in the next area of our world. That we're seeing in not only here in Canada, where there's a housing crisis and the governments are trying to find ways to quickly house immigrants as they're coming, refugees from different conflicts around the world. That how are they handling this? Canada is in one of our segments is going to make some announcements about housing, about economy. You're going to hear from Chrystia Freeland as they talk about those sort of things. In New York, if I invite you to go check this out. In New York City, that they are putting emergency immigrants into schools. They're closing the schools as classrooms, and are putting people who need the housing into those schools or into hotels. In some cases, the hotels are making a mint of profits from it. But the issue is that the government there is desperately trying to find ways to put people in houses and housing that will keep them safe from weather and help them find ways to feed people and all the other issues that go along with helping immigrants into a country on a massive scale. In between the United States and Canada, we are known around the world for helping refugees and helping those who need and are desperate need of a home. So we're doing that is the job of our government, is also reaching around the world and helping people so that they can find a decent home and a decent life. That also means being able to find a job while not taking away a job from someone who's already been here. To find a home without taking away from something from somebody who's already been here. To find a way of life without being a burden on those who have already been here. So it's a tall job for our governments. So why don't we start off while listening to the United Nations and the Security Council talk about what's happening in Gaza in the Middle East and how humanitarian needs aren't being met in Gaza, in Syria, in other parts of our world. And then we'll finally hear from Chrystia Freeland as she has a press announcement about housing, and of course she is the Minister of Finance as well as being the Deputy Prime Minister. So she has things to say about what's going on in the world, and she is going to make a statement especially about what's happening between Russia and the Ukraine and how Canada is in full support of helping President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin as he tries to justify his reasons for wanting to invade Ukraine, as this is going on for almost 2 years now.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for this opportunity to brief the Council on the current food security crisis in Gaza, together with my colleagues from OCHA and FAO. As you have already heard, the Famine Review Committee has warned of a real prospect of famine by May, with over 500,000 people at risk if that threat is allowed to materialize. Even before October, 2/3 of the people in Gaza were supported with food assistance. Today, food aid is required by almost the entire population of 2.2 million people. Gaza is seeing the worst level of child malnutrition anywhere in the world. 1 child in every 6 under the age of 2 is acutely malnourished. The World Food Programme is ready to swiftly expand and scale up our operations if there is a ceasefire agreement. But in the meantime, the risk of famine is being fueled by the inability to bring critical food supplies into Gaza in sufficient quantities, and the almost impossible operating conditions faced by our staff on the ground. Conditions in northern Gaza are particularly dire. On Sunday, February 18, we resumed deliveries to the north for the first time in 3 weeks. Our intention was to send 10 trucks per day for 7 days to address immediate needs and provide some reassurance to people living there that sufficient food would be brought in. However, on both February 18 and 19, our convoys faced significant obstacles. There were delays at checkpoints, they faced gunfire and other violence, food was looted along the way, and at their destination, they were overwhelmed by desperately hungry people. As a result, we've been forced to pause deliveries of food to the north until conditions are in place that allow for safe distributions, both for our staff and for the people receiving our assistance. This is not a decision WFP has taken lightly, as we know it means conditions will worsen and more people will be at risk of dying from hunger-related causes. But the breakdown in civil order, driven by sheer desperation, is preventing the safe distribution of aid. We are now urgently exploring all viable delivery options to allow the resumption of operations in northern Gaza as soon as possible. This is an absolute humanitarian imperative. The staff on our convoys witnessed catastrophic conditions in the north. Food and clean water are scarce, malnutrition is soaring, and disease is rife. Madam President, immediate action is required to enable a huge increase in the volume of food and other humanitarian supplies going into northern Gaza. This is the only way to calm tension and restore some semblance of civil order. For this to happen, we need a functioning operating environment. We need the port of Ashdod and the Kearney crossing to open so we can import food and other essential supplies swiftly and at scale. And we need a working humanitarian notification system and a stable communications network to keep humanitarian staff safe. If nothing changes, a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. We must all double down and live up to our responsibilities to ensure it does not happen on our watch. Meanwhile, in the south of Gaza, WFP and partners are on the ground delivering food as it comes to shelters, to makeshift camps, and to shops. But we're unable to provide regular or sufficient food to people who badly need it. Most food is distributed in Rafah, the hub of WFP's current operations in Gaza, and very little assistance reaches people elsewhere. WFP has made efforts to support the re-establishment of local food systems wherever possible. This has included expanding distribution points to include local shops, supporting bakeries by providing them the wheat flour and other necessary resources to operate, and supplying community-run kitchens that provide hot meals every day. But the fact remains that without safe and greatly expanded access, aid workers cannot mount a relief operations at the scale required to reverse the severe humanitarian crisis now gripping Gaza. It is essential we avert a famine, and this requires much more than just food supplies. Basic services must also be restored, including health services, electricity networks, and water and sanitation pipelines. In this, UNRWA is indispensable. Council members, in 2018, this body adopted Security Council Resolution 2417, which reaffirms international humanitarian law and the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity. Today, we call on the Council to uphold its commitments under that resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, in Resolution 2417 of 2018, you requested the Secretary General report to you swiftly when the risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity occurred in armed conflict. And I'm here to report on a grave situation in Gaza. Our discussion today will come as no surprise. Since the start of the current hostilities following the horrific Hamas attacks in Israel on October 7, the UN has warned about the potentially deleterious impact on food insecurity in Gaza, particularly for a population already experiencing high levels of structural poverty after 16 years of blockade. In December, it was projected that the entire population of 2.2 million people in Gaza would face high levels of acute food insecurity by February 2024. The highest share of people facing this level of food insecurity ever recorded worldwide. And here we are at the end of February, with at least 576,000 people in Gaza, 1/4 of the population, one step away from famine, with 1 in 6 children under 2 years of age in northern Gaza suffering from acute malnutrition and wasting. And practically the entire population of Gaza are left to rely on woefully inadequate humanitarian food assistance to survive. Unfortunately, as grim as the picture we see today, there is every possibility for further deterioration. Military operations, insecurity, and extensive restrictions on the entry and delivery of essential goods have decimated food production and agriculture. Food security experts warn of complete agricultural collapse in northern Gaza by May if conditions persist, with fields and productive assets damaged, destroyed, or inaccessible. Many have had little choice but to abandon productive farmland due to evacuation orders and repeated displacement. The hostilities and shortages of essential supplies, including electricity, fuel, and water, have left food production at a virtual standstill. The 5 mills operating in Gaza prior to October 7 ceased operations as far back as November. Heavy damage to water infrastructure from fighting and the severing of power and fuel supplies in October have significantly affected access to water that is essential for food production and the prevention of malnutrition and illness. Fishing, long an important source of nutrition and income in Gaza, has been a practical impossibility since October 7, when sea access for boats was entirely prohibited. A lack of fodder and water, as well as the fighting, has also claimed the lives of livestock, removing yet another important source of food and income. And the commercial sector, a key part of the food distribution network prior to October 7, has been crippled by the lack of local produce and extensive restrictions on commercial imports. Commodities such as wheat flour and eggs and dairy have been almost entirely depleted in parts of Gaza. Meanwhile, the scarcity of available products has sent prices soaring to prohibitive levels at a time when livelihoods have been wiped out by the conflict. Hunger and the risk of famine are exacerbated by factors that go beyond just the availability of food. Inadequate water, sanitation, and health services creates a cycle of vulnerability where malnourished people, especially among the tens of thousands of people who are injured, become more susceptible to disease that further depletes the body's nutritional reserves. A steep rise in malnutrition among children and pregnant and breastfeeding women in the Gaza Strip is a particularly grave concern. And add chronic overcrowding, exposure to the cold, and an absence of adequate shelter to this lack of nutrition, and you have created the conditions for massive disease epidemics. My colleagues from the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization will address these issues in more detail. Madam President, with people in Gaza unable to rely on markets and other usual sources of food, humanitarian food assistance is now nearly the sole source of subsistence. Yet, as we have reported to the Council on numerous occasions, the humanitarian community is facing overwhelming obstacles just to get a bare minimum of supplies into Gaza, let alone mounting the multi-sectoral response that would be required to avert a famine. Our efforts continue to be beset by crossing closures, serious movement restrictions, access denials, onerous vetting procedures, incidents involving desperate civilians, protests and a breakdown in law and order, restrictions on communications and protective equipment, and impassable supply routes due to damaged roads and unexploded ordnance. Security risks remain a significant obstacle. The shelling on 20 February of the Médecins Sans Frontières guest house in Al Mawasi highlights the weak implementation of precautions that all parties are required to take, and of the humanitarian notification system that aims to maximize these. This has left operations extremely dangerous for humanitarian workers. And we cannot forget the 161 humanitarian workers killed in the hostilities so far. And the suspension of funding to UNRWA challenges our capacity to mount any effective response. An estimated 1.7 million people, over 3/4 of the population of Gaza, reside in UNRWA-run and other public emergency shelters. Last week, the Commissioner General informed the General Assembly that the agency's ability to fulfill its mandate is now seriously threatened and that its operations in the region will be severely compromised from March. Nevertheless, we continue ceaselessly to plan, search, and call for solutions to overcome the hurdles that would allow us to scale up food delivery and health services. In the immediate term, this includes clearer security guarantees, a better humanitarian notification system to minimize risks, fewer restrictions on telecommunications equipment, the removal of unexploded ordnance, and the use of all possible entry points. The stark reality, however, is that a response at the level required will be impossible without immediate and concerted action by the parties, the Security Council, other member states, and the wider international community. The White Note submitted to this Council sets out recommendations for this action. It includes ensuring respect for international humanitarian law, the resumption of entry of essential food, electricity, fuel, and cooking gas, including by the private sector, the protection and restoration of vital infrastructure and services, including cross-border water pipelines, the lifting of restrictions on fishing activity, access to farmland and the entry of agricultural goods, urgently facilitating greater humanitarian access into and within Gaza, including opening up additional crossing points, and finally, concerted efforts towards ending this conflict altogether. But without a doubt, at this stage, very little will be possible while hostilities continue and while there is a risk that they will spread into the overcrowded areas of south of Gaza. We therefore reiterate our call for a ceasefire. If nothing is done, we fear widespread famine in Gaza is almost inevitable, and the conflict, which since October has claimed the lives of almost 30,000 people and injured more than 70,000, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, will have many more victims. We put this before the Council as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingham.
The UN Security Report on what is happening in Syria, also part of the Middle East.
Mr. Peterson, can you hear me?
Yes, Madam President, I can hear you.
Good morning. You
I'm
have the
ready to
floor.
start. Thank you. Madam President, let me first express my deep concern about the situation on the ground in Syria and the devastating impact it's having on civilians. This month, we have seen further spillover effects from regional conflict. Multiple airstrikes attributed to Israel, including on residential areas of Homs and Damascus, reportedly resulted in both civilian and military casualties, including advisors from Iran's Revolutionary Guards. In some instances, Israel confirmed it carried out airstrikes in what it said was a response to ongoing rocket attacks launched from southern Syria towards occupied Syrian Golan. The US carried out what it described as retaliatory strikes for a drone attack on a US post in Jordan near the border with Syria that resulted in military casualties. The US claimed that Iranian-backed groups were behind this and other attacks on US bases, a claim Iran denies. The US strikes hit dozens of what they say were Iran-linked targets in Syria and Iraq, with Syrian state media reporting both military and civilian casualties. Meanwhile, Madam President, all other vectors of the Syrian conflict itself continue and remain the biggest cause of civilian casualties and displacement. This month, the entire north of the country, containing millions of civilians, has seen multiple frontline skirmishes, exchange of artillery, rocket and sniper fire, along with pro-government and HTS drone strikes and Turkish drone strikes. ISIL attacks continue to rise in quantity and impact, particularly in the central and northeastern regions. Southern Syria remains violent and unstable, with further killings and clashes in Deraa, as well as fresh confrontations between the Jordanian army and what they say were arms smugglers on the Syrian-Jordanian border. Plainly, the tension in the region needs to be urgently de-escalating, starting with the immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza that the Secretary General has called for. And, Madam President, we equally plainly need urgent de-escalation inside Syria, building on existing ceasefire arrangements towards a nationwide ceasefire in line with Resolution 2254. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Security Council listed terrorist groups must be fought in a manner that is cooperative and firmly in line with international law and that prioritizes the protection of civilians. I impressed these points on key international stakeholders when I convened an international Syria support group ceasefire task force plenary meeting here in Geneva earlier this month. All voices around the table assured that none wish to see further escalation. A welcome sentiment I heard in engagement with regional
Well, sorry, I
ministers
didn't mean to break the system.
It is vital that all stakeholders act accordingly. Madam President, a year after the devastating earthquakes in Syria and Turkey that killed thousands and displaced millions,
Thank you so much.
Syria's humanitarian crisis has only deepened. On the one hand, we have received some good news with the Syrian government's recent extensions of its authorization for the UN to use Bab al-Haba, Bab al-Salam, and Al-Riya border crossings, but the broader humanitarian trends are bleaker than ever. And I'm sure that Martin will give you quite a few details on how serious the situation really are. But just to remind you a couple of headlines. What is needed is more access by all modalities, including cross-line convoys, more donor support, including for early recovery and livelihoods, and greater efforts to mitigate any adverse effects of sanctions on ordinary Syrians. Madam President, meanwhile, we still see no concrete results in addressing the situation of an estimated 100,000 arbitrarily detained, forcibly disappeared, and missing persons as called for in Resolution 2254. This month, I met once again with families of missing and detained persons hailing from all areas of Syria, who continue to live both in agony and hope of seeing their detained loved ones released, or at least knowing their whereabouts and fate. On this, let me reiterate my support for the General Assembly's decision to establish the independent institution on missing persons. We have indeed a collective responsibility to help its work. Madam President, over 18 months ago, I issued invitations for the 9th session of the Constitutional Committee to take place in Geneva. That session did not take place because, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed this month, Russia no longer considers Switzerland a neutral venue, and the Syrian government did not accept Geneva as a result. From the outset, I have been clear about several points. Let me remind you about 4 of them. First, I have reminded all that the Syrian government and Syrian negotiations commissions in the terms of reference for the committee, agreed on Geneva and stressed that the process should take place without foreign interference. Second, as a facilitator, I will be creative in trying to find a way forward for all parties, including exploring all possible alternatives. Third, if the Syrian government and Syrian Negotiations Commission reach consensus on a venue other than Geneva, I will support this. And fourth, this non-Syrian issue needs to be overcome so that the Syrian-led and owned UN facilitated process could continue. Madam President, guided by this approach, over 18 months, with the support of various outside stakeholders, including the Astana guarantors and the Arab Contact Group, various venues have been floated. But I'm sorry to say, the reality is this: not one has yet enjoyed the minimum consent required of both Syrian parties and the potential host itself. I had warned that this may be the case when these issues were first raised 18 months ago. I myself have recently proposed a further option, that the 9th session could be convened in the UN office at Nairobi. I appreciate my UN colleagues in Nairobi being ready to do all that was required to help us host. I recently commended this way out to the Syrian parties. I also relayed a further suggestion from one Syrian party to the other on an alternative regional venue. However, I regret to say that consensus among the Syrian parties was not found on either venue, just as it had not been on earlier suggestions. Madam President, having left no stone unturned to find an alternative venue, I believe the only way forward at this time is to reconvene in Geneva, at least as a bridging proposal, while there is no consensus on an alternative venue, while also remaining open to an alternative venue for future sessions if consensus is found. This is something I have flagged for some time, may be the only way forward if no alternative could be found. Therefore, Madam President, I am today issuing formal invitations for a 9th round in Geneva in late April. I appeal today to the Syrian parties to respond positively and to all key international stakeholders to support the UN's actions as a facilitator and refrain from interfering regarding a venue the Syrian parties themselves had formally agreed. I believe it's important for the Constitutional Committee to meet as soon as possible and to continue its work. An indefinite hiatus can only undermine the Constitutional Committee's credibility and work. Madam President, at the same time, I have always said that the Constitutional Committee cannot alone solve this conflict. The Resolution 2254 speaks to a wide range of issues. Let me remind this Council once again that clear ideas for step-for-step confidence-building measures addressing core elements of Resolution 2254 remain on the table. I stand ready to enter into discussions to flesh out all details and operational aspects with all Syrian parties and other stakeholders where willingness is shown on the proposals table or to receive alternative ideas. Madam President, as we look to find ways to fully implement Resolution 2254, we continue to draw on the insights and advice of a broad spectrum of Syrians, including the Women's Advisory Board and Civil Society Support Room, who convened in Geneva this month and met with each other too. It was heartening to see a wide spectrum of Syrian women and men discussed common ground and practical ways forwards, despite significant differences among them. They discussed essential issues such as local governance and possibilities for a coherent, decentralized approach for the whole of Syria, in line with national sovereignty and territorial integrity and Resolution 2254. Women Advisory Board members held insightful discussions on other challenges and opportunities, including areas for commonalities such as in the field of education. Finally, Madam President, I have outlined some elements for immediate action: getting the Constitutional Committee back on track, traction on step-for-step confidence-building measures, and immediate de-escalation. However, we must be honest with ourselves. Such entry points cannot, in and of themselves, solve the Syrian conflict. I continue to hear from many Syrians and outside players too, on different sides of the conflict, that we must embed the initiatives we have developed in the broader approach and package. One that puts all of the needs and concerns of Syrian and international stakeholders on the table. One that involves all necessary stakeholders, and one that involves compromise from all players. Ultimately, this is how to ensure the protection of Syrian civilians and allow the Syrian people to realize their legitimate aspirations, while also in lockstep ensuring Syria's socio-economic recovery and restoring Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. Madam President, I know this may seem to be an inopportune time. I know very well that international attention is focused on multiple other crises. But there might also be a sense in some quarters that the conflict is easier just to manage and far too difficult to solve. Such thinking is mistaken. Look at the trends. The regional spillover is only the latest accelerant to a conflict that is growing in complexity with each passing year. The situation is worsening on almost all indicators, and the status quo is unsustainable and unmanageable. As I discussed with you all last month, we have to prepare the ground and work for a broader approach to resolving this conflict in line with Resolution 2254. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Peterson for his briefing. I now
Chrystia Freeland talking about finance and a new housing announcement to be announced by the Canadian federal government.
OK. Bonjour tout le monde. Dans un instant, je vous parlerai de la situation économique actuelle au Canada et de la manière dont notre plan économique rend la vie plus abordable pour les Canadiennes et les Canadiens. Le ministre Fraser fera ensuite part des mesures spécifiques prises par notre gouvernement pour relever le défi du logement au Canada de façon nouvelle et avant-gardiste. Enfin, nous passerons la parole au ministre Champagne qui parlera du travail accompli par notre gouvernement pour améliorer la concurrence et fournir à la population canadienne l'information dont elle a besoin pour faire des choix éclairés lors de l'achat de produits d'épicerie. We know there's a lot of work ahead, but we also know with our economic plan, we're on the right track. We learned last week that inflation in Canada fell to 2.9% in January. That's down from 3.4% the month before and down from its peak of 8.1%. This is making a real difference in the lives of Canadians. This is real progress. At 2.9% in January, inflation was back within the Bank of Canada's target range. Thanks to the hard work of Canadians and Canadian businesses, we also learned that we gained 37,000 new jobs last month. That was double expectations. Today, 1.1 million more Canadians are working compared to before the pandemic. A strong labor market really matters for affordability. Wage growth has outpaced inflation for the past 12 months as of January. Real wages after accounting for inflation, are now higher than they were just before the pandemic, meaning paychecks are worth more. This is progress, but we all know that many Canadians are still struggling to make ends meet, struggling to juggle all of their bills at the end of the month, and to feel confident about the future. So we really do know we have a lot more work to do to unlock a brighter future for everyone in our amazing country. C'est pourquoi l'un des principaux objectifs de notre plan économique est de construire plus de logements plus rapidement. Au cours des derniers mois, nous avons déjà pris des mesures importantes pour débloquer des milliards de dollars en nouveaux fonds pour bâtir des centaines de milliers de logements partout au Canada. Nous réfléchissons sans cesse à de nouvelles façons d'accroître encore davantage l'offre sur le marché du logement. Dans un instant, le ministre Fraser nous fera part d'un plan intéressant pour développer des nouvelles technologies de construction de logements et pour stimuler l'innovation dans le secteur de l'habitation. Another major part of our plan is improving competition across the economy, particularly in the critical grocery sector. As François-Philippe will explain in a minute, more competition means lower prices and more choice. And by increasing competition and cracking down on unfair and anti-competitive practices, we will help Canadians when they check out at the grocery store. And later this week, we will have more to share about a new plan to bring down costs for Canadians. And let me announce that this week, we are issuing our second Canadian dollar-denominated green bond. This follows the successful issuance of Canada's first 7.5-year, $5 billion green bond in March 2022. This issuance will be the first under Canada's updated green bond framework. And as we announced in the fall economic statement, the framework will now include certain nuclear expenditures. This makes Canada the first country to include nuclear expenditures in a green bond. It shows our commitment to build on our strengths and to be a global nuclear leader. And in fact, the Prime Minister had some great conversations about that with our Polish allies. I guess it was just yesterday. Green bonds unlock private financing to speed up projects like green infrastructure, and these projects will create jobs and drive economic growth while fighting climate change. This is our economic plan in action. Thank you very much. And we do have a lot of things to talk about this morning. So over to François-Philippe.
Merci, Chrystia. Indeed, very good news with respect to the green bond and adding nuclear. As you know, Canada too can do, and also the recent acquisition of Cameco of Westinghouse. We basically, have access to half of the installed base in the world. So there is a lot of opportunities. So, bonjour tout le monde. Grand plaisir d'être avec vous ce mardi matin. Écoutez, avant de commencer, je voulais revenir sur une annonce importante qu'on a faite hier dans le logement au Québec. Vous avez peut-être vu, hier, on a annoncé 1000 logements pour nos aînés, des logements abordables. Vous avez peut-être vu, le concept est fort intéressant. On parle de 10 immeubles de 100 logements dans 10 villes à travers le Québec. Pour moi, c'est une annonce importante parce qu'on parle d'un projet innovant, on parle d'un partenariat exemplaire entre des municipalités, le gouvernement du Québec, évidemment, le gouvernement fédéral. L'idée, c'est de construire plus, de construire mieux et certainement de construire plus rapidement parce que dans ce dossier-là, vous allez voir, la construction va se faire très rapidement. C'est un investissement de près de 235 millions de dollars, donc un investissement des plus importants entre nous et le gouvernement du Québec. Et je le dis souvent, en matière de logement abordable, on en a parlé, maintenant on livre, et je pense que c'est une bonne nouvelle parce que ça va permettre d'assurer la santé et sécurité de nos aînés tout en leur permettant de vieillir dans la dignité. Alors, merci à mon collègue, le ministre Fraser, parce que je peux vous dire que cette entente-là, avec le gouvernement du Québec, offre des dividendes concrets pour les gens au Québec et certainement nos aînés. You will record that ever since we summoned grocery CEOs to Ottawa last fall, we have seen a gradual stabilization of food inflation across the country. But more needs to be done to ensure that all Canadians' families can afford the grocery they need. I am pleased to see that after our government adopted our affordability bill in December, the Competition Bureau wasted no time to use its new powers, launching an investigation into potential anti-competitive restrictive covenants. Those are the famous clauses I talked to you about in leases where if you had one of the large grocers would for all purpose and intent, would basically restrict anyone of an independent or anyone else coming to within a certain radius to have competition. So these practices, as you would probably appreciate, discourage grocers from competing in the same area and to offer better prices to Canadians. That's why they needed to be rooted out. And I would say, talking to CEOs of global food chains around the world, they see that as one of the major steps that we have taken in order to allow for more competition in Canada. And that was the same message we also received from the Independent Grocer Associations of Canada. Those who represent 4,900 independent grocers told us there's two things that would make a real difference in Canada was to root out these clauses that would prevent them from being in the vicinity of one of the large incumbents and also having a grocery code of conduct. These are tangible results that prove that we need to use every tool in our toolbox to increase competition in Canada. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And as the Deputy Prime Minister said, we're going to look at every tool in the toolbox to make sure that we support Canadians. Laissez-moi commencer par quelques explications. En vertu de la loi sur la concurrence, comme vous le savez, toutes les fusions, peu importe leur ampleur ou le secteur économique concerné, peuvent être examinées par le Bureau de la concurrence. Pour les compagnies qui souhaitent fusionner et que la transaction dépasse un certain seuil, ces dernières doivent notifier proactivement le Bureau de la concurrence afin qu'il puisse examiner la transaction et considérer ses impacts sur la concurrence. Normalement, ce seuil-là est indexé en fonction du produit intérieur brut, ce qu'on appelle le PIB. Or, avec la récente croissance marquée du PIB, ce qui est une bonne chose, je dirais, je suis sûr que la ministre des Finances serait d'accord avec ça, notre gouvernement a choisi d'agir. C'est pour cela que pour une troisième année consécutive, nous allons geler ce seuil à 93 millions de dollars. Et je vais vous dire un instant pourquoi c'est important et pourquoi ce que ça veut dire concrètement aussi pour les gens. C'est important parce que si vous regardez sur le graphique présentement, si on n'avait pas agi au cours des 3 années pour geler, ce qu'on serait rendu, sans notre intervention, le seuil serait maintenant rendu à plus de 120 millions de dollars. Donc, ça veut dire que seulement les transactions dans cette braquette-là seraient soumises évidemment à la revue du Bureau de la concurrence. Maintenant, comme on a gelé le seuil depuis les dernières années, le seuil est à 93 millions de dollars, c'est-à-dire à ce niveau-là, vous devez notifier le Bureau de la concurrence. Ça veut dire que si on n'avait pas gelé le seuil comme on propose de le faire et comme on a fait depuis les dernières années, une entreprise qui proposerait une fusion de 100 millions de dollars, par exemple, n'aurait pas eu l'obligation de notifier le Bureau de la concurrence. Alors, ce que vous comprenez derrière ça, c'est que plus on a de visibilité sur les fusions au pays, évidemment, ça nous permet d'agir pour préserver la concurrence. It matters, and it matters to people at home. Why? Because by maintaining the threshold, we are ensuring that the Competition Bureau is notified of more transactions in all sectors of the economy, allowing it to review them and determine if they are likely to prevent or substantially lessen competition in our country. So that is a very important threshold because that gives us more visibility and having a better outlook, I would say, of the competitive landscape in the country. Et ce que ça demande aussi, ce que ça veut dire, c'est une plus grande transparence de la part d'un plus grand nombre d'entreprises au pays. Indeed, this will ensure that potentially harmful deals are fully scrutinized by the Competition Bureau. It also reflects the government's ongoing commitment to see more competition in the marketplace through a robust enforcement framework. And I must say that in previous budget, you probably recall that we have made probably the largest investment in enforcement capabilities of the Competition Bureau. Mr. Finance, I think, was in 2 years ago, we put $90 million to make sure that we would have the means of enforcing the legislation. And obviously now with these, the threshold that we're maintaining, and also the new powers we have given to the Competition Bureau, I think people see that we are very committed to make sure that the Competition Bureau in Canada would be strong, would be efficient, but also would have more teeth in order to make sure that we prevent mergers that would be harmful to competition. But it's clear, and I think everyone would agree, more needs to be done. That's why we want to give the Bureau more tools to review mergers, and why we have put in the last budget the bill implementing the fall economic statement. There are additional measures, as the Minister of Finance was talking about, to strengthen competition. And why do we want to make these changes? Well, it's very clear, because we know that we still need to complete our reform of competition. That's probably the single most important thing we would have done as a government over the medium to long term in order to change the competitive landscape in the country. We're going to do that in this bill by updating the merger notification rules, by giving the Bureau a longer period. We're talking now about 3 years to review mergers that aren't notified otherwise, and by introducing temporary bans on closing transactions about to face a challenge in order to prevent loss of valuable Canadian IP. You could say that we'll have powers now for these mergers not to go ahead if obviously we are looking into anti-competitive practices, and the fact that they could get access to IP would be harmful. If Conservatives really want to make life more affordable for Canadians, they would support this long overdue reform of the Competition Act. And I must say, we did broad-based consultation, and we need to act now. Finally, I'm happy to announce today another call for proposal for projects to protect and empower Canadian consumers. Je l'ai dit à plusieurs reprises, nous devons développer une culture de défense des consommateurs plus forte à travers le pays. Et c'est quelque chose, évidemment, que le gouvernement canadien ne peut pas faire seul. With the selected organizations, we will develop and implement projects that focus on groceries to help consumers make the best choice for their family and their budget. Canadians deserve more transparency when it comes to grocery. They need to be better informed. I can tell you, me and my colleagues, we are committed to have more competition, more choices for consumer, and certainly more transparency. With that, it's going to be a real pleasure to pass on the microphone to my colleague, Minister Fraser.
Excellent, et merci, et félicitations pour les projets dans votre circonscription aussi. Look, today I've got some news to share that's exciting in the nature of how it's going to help identify unique solutions that are going to help us address the housing crisis. If we're actually going to overcome the challenge before us, we need to build homes differently and explore new ways that allow us to scale up home building. We've developed the Affordable Housing Innovation Fund to identify projects that will examine new ways to build homes and allow us to achieve a level of scale by exploring new solutions to build homes more quickly. This is going to involve new technologies, new designs, new solutions to create the next generation of housing in this country. That's why today I'm pleased to share that we're going to be rolling out agreements with 8 different home building organizations through this fund across Canada. It's going to involve a total investment of $123 million from the federal government, which we expect will yield more than 5,600 homes, affordable homes, across Canada, in a way that's going to not only give us the output in terms of the new units that are brought online, but also the solutions that we're going to be able to deploy in new applications right across the country. The kinds of projects that are going to benefit from this particular round of funding includes modular housing, housing that's building affordable housing units and missing middle units with panelization, which is one of the most cost-effective and labor-efficient ways that we can build new homes in this country. It's going to include 2 different organizations that are focusing on rent-to-own initiatives. It's going to create an opportunity for young Canadians to get into the housing market. One through creating a pool of investors who will share equity across a portfolio of homes, and another that's actually going to create an opportunity to allow tenants to become mortgage ready by establishing a credit history through the successful applicant that will allow the renter to demonstrate making their rent payments on time to justify establishing credit for the purpose of taking out a mortgage in the future. There's also an organization that's going to be using land that's been provided by religious organizations to reduce the input costs for new affordable housing builds. There's going to be several projects that focus on new affordable housing that comes with energy efficiency components, which will ensure that we don't only offer rent at an affordable price, but that energy costs are kept low as well as we deploy these new solutions. And finally, there's going to be an Indigenous-led organization that's providing supportive housing with wraparound services targeting specifically Métis people with housing needs, often who are engaged in fleeing domestic violence or seeking to overcome challenges with addictions. This is a really exciting opportunity from my perspective, not just because it's going to yield more than 5,600 homes, but because we're going to be able to identify whether and to what extent these solutions have a broader application that will allow us to scale over time. We're going to continue to look for new ways to build homes, not just more homes, but build homes in a different way that allow us to identify solutions that will allow us to overcome the housing crisis in the years ahead. With that, I want to say thank you very much and looking forward to what questions you may have.
Thank you very much to our trio of ministers. We will now open the floor to questions. As is our custom, it is 1 question, 1 follow-up per reporter. We will begin in the room. We do have some colleagues online, but I'm not sure time will allow for that today. And with that, we will kick things off with Bill Curry of the Globe and Mail.
Good morning. For Minister Freeland and Mr. Fraser. Yesterday, there was over a dozen big city mayors in town expressing concern about the signals that they're getting ahead of the budget. As you know, there's a bunch of long-term infrastructure programs put in place almost a decade ago that are now starting to expire. They're very concerned about that. Trudeau had promised to renew them in the fall. That didn't happen. And so they're saying with all these housing announcements, the government seems to be losing focus on the needs for basic infrastructure to support those houses, and there's no longer the long-term funds that they can tap into to plan their budget. So what is your response to those concerns?
I'll say a couple things, and then I think maybe Sean wants to say a couple things too. So let me start by saying there is no federal government in Canadian history that has invested as ambitiously and as aggressively in infrastructure as our government. It was actually the centerpiece of our 2015 campaign commitment, and we have delivered on that. And I think it's really important for people to understand that that money is actually ramping up in the years ahead. Infrastructure takes a long time to build, and the money is on the books, and there's going to be more and more going forward. So in 23-24, there is $4.3 billion of federal money going into infrastructure across the country. In 24-25, it is nearly $5 billion. That is money already committed. In 25-26, it is more than $7 billion. And so, people just need to understand the money is there. It is out there building things across Canada. And I think we all recognize that when we travel around Canadian cities. Last week I was in Winnipeg, Quebec City, and Toronto, and you just look around and you see infrastructure being built. That is a really good thing. Second, as Sean said, we recognize that housing is the central challenge for Canadians right now. When people talk about affordability, yes, they're talking about prices at the grocery store, and François-Philippe is doing terrific work there. The single biggest thing in families' budgets is paying your mortgage or paying the rent. And we know that the solution there is we just have to build more faster. We are absolutely committed to that, and we are doing it. You have seen a tremendous rollout of housing, not just projects, but housing measures over the past few months, whether it is lifting the GST on purpose-built rental, that's 200 to 300,000 new homes. Sean has been zooming around the country doing housing accelerator fund deals. I think we're at 550,000 new homes built that way. Our former rental construction financing initiative, now it's the Apartment Construction Loan Fund, that has been topped up, and that is responsible for hundreds of thousands of homes being built. So we get that. We are working hard to do more and more on housing, and we do recognize that we have to have conversations around being sure that there is the infrastructure to support that housing. But I just want to conclude by going back to where I started, which is there is a lot of money in the pipeline right now building the infrastructure that Canada needs, and we are glad that we have put that money out there. Sean?
First, I had an opportunity to meet last night with Mayor Chow, and in the last number of weeks have spoken with Charlie Clark, Mike Savage, was in Regina recently with Mayor Masters, and continue to engage with mayors of not just big cities, but small towns across Canada as well. We know that we need to partner with municipal governments if we're going to succeed in our goals to experience economic growth, build livable communities, and make sure that there's enough homes for people to live in. And we know that involves making investments in infrastructure as well. There's some unique concepts that are being pitched by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities around a new municipal growth framework. There's some very interesting ideas that I'm interested in continuing to explore. We don't have a policy announcement today, but I'm going to continue to engage to understand what the right path forward looks like. But to Minister Freeland's point, let's not pretend that we haven't made investing in infrastructure a strategic priority over the course of our time in office. If I look at programs like the Canada Community Building Fund, this is billions of dollars every year that's building out essential municipal infrastructure and empowering local governments to make decisions about how that money is going to be spent. We're currently rolling out the $4 billion Green and Inclusive Community Building Fund. We have projects that are still rolling out under the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund that are delivering on climate resilient infrastructure, which in many cases actually creates an opportunity to build more homes and communities. There's still projects going through the Investing in Canada infrastructure plan. Many billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars worth of projects have been leveraged. Going forward, there's a new ambition from the Canada Infrastructure Bank as they've stepped up their financing programs to deliver a range of different kinds of infrastructure, and they're now exploring housing enabling infrastructure in addition to some of the measures that they put in place before. And coming online in 2026, so we'll be in a position to begin negotiations sooner than that. The new $3 billion annual permanent public transit fund is going to help ensure that we remain a funding partner on a permanent basis for public transit that's going to create opportunities for people to move through their communities, to access opportunities, and in fact to get more homes built through transit-oriented development. So on each of these programs, we have literally been investing billions of dollars to make sure that communities have the capacity to deal with the growth that they've been experiencing. We believe it's in Canada's national economic interest to build out some of this infrastructure. So before we get too far down the road of what may come next, we have billions of dollars of programs that we're deploying actively now with a view to make communities more livable and to enable more homes to be built at the same time.
Okay, thanks. As well as my colleagues, we don't have a lot of time to keep our answers as succinct as possible, so we can get through as many questions as possible this morning would be wonderful. Bill, go ahead with your follow-up.
Thanks. And just for Ms. Freeland, another question on long-term spending plans, as it's the time of year that you weigh such things. Last week, the head of NATO asked Canada for a firm deadline for when it's going to meet the 2% defense spending target. That is an estimated cost about $20 billion more per year than Ottawa currently spends. What is your response? Is such a timeline coming?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. And the Prime Minister spoke at some length about that in Warsaw yesterday. So let me just highlight some of the key things he pointed out. First, Canada today is one of the big spenders in NATO. We are the 7th biggest spending NATO country out of 31. Second, I think it's really worth pointing out that it was under the previous Conservative government that Canada's defense spending fell to below 1%. And our government has significantly ramped up defense spending. In 2016-17, we were spending just over $18 billion a year on defense. In 26-27, we're going to be spending $40 billion a year on defense. That is without any new commitments. That is a lot of money. And then the final thing that I'll say is, of course, financing matters. What also matters is being effective and being there when it matters. And certainly from my perspective, the most acute security challenge in the world today, at this moment, to the rules-based international order, the front lines of the fight between democracy and dictatorship runs through Ukraine. That's where the battle is not theoretical. That's where the battle is joined. And I think as Canadians, we should be really grateful to the brave people of Ukraine. They are the ones who are fighting and dying. But I think we can take some comfort from the fact that we are really there with them. The Prime Minister's choice to be in Ukraine on the 2nd anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was a big deal. It meant a lot to the people of Ukraine to see him there. What meant even more is we committed $3 billion this year to support Ukraine in its fight. And the Prime Minister signed with President Zelensky a long-term security agreement, including multi-year funding for weapons for Ukraine. And then finally, something that the Ukrainians really appreciate and is making a difference every day, Canada is a leader when it comes to training Ukrainian troops. Operation Unifier has been doing that since 2015. We have now trained more than 40,000 Ukrainians. Bill Blair and I had the privilege on Sunday to see some of the fantastic Canadian trainers together with our Polish allies training the Ukrainians. They were training medics. And look, I know you guys are journalists and your job is to be skeptics. I remember those days myself. But I have to say it was incredibly moving to see, the Ukrainians who were there. It was men and women. It was young people and old people. It was a group of people from Eastern Ukraine who had been on the front lines. And the Canadians told me, they said, there is not a lazy student here. One of the women got injured during her training, and she said, take me out of the hospital. I want to keep on being trained because every single medic saves lives, and the Russians are targeting the Ukrainian medics. They actually cover up their medic banners because when they see a medic banner, rather than avoiding them, they target them. And we have Canadians right there today. They're training those Ukrainians. That, to me, that's the point of our defense spending. And I'm grateful to our brave Canadian men and women in uniform who are doing it. Sorry for the long answer.
Okay. I will cut you off. No, maybe. We'll go next to Promit from Reuters.
Good morning, Minister. My name is Promit Mukherjee from Reuters. So you are heading off to the G20 summit in Brazil. And the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen just said that it's absolutely necessary and urgent to actually support and unlock the frozen assets of Russia. Do you agree with this, or do you have concerns on repurposing these assets?
Thank you for the question. I am actually getting on a plane, in fact, 3 different planes, to get to that G7 and G20 meeting. And I had a long conversation with Secretary Yellen over the weekend. This is an issue that I have been discussing with her for not just months, but really since the war began. The issue of the assets of the Russian Central Bank has been a central Canadian preoccupation. We have thought from the outset that that was a very, very important point of leverage. And Canada was very strongly involved in the initial decision to freeze the assets of the Russian Central Bank. And we have been centrally involved in the work being done to take the next step and confiscate those assets. So I have been working closely with Secretary Yellen. She and I agree 100%. The Prime Minister is very engaged in this work, and at the G7 leaders meeting that happened on Saturday while the Prime Minister was in Kyiv, he advanced the issue very strongly. When we were in Warsaw yesterday, the Prime Minister, and I was part of the conversation too, discussed the issue with Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And if you look back to our press conference yesterday, Prime Minister Tusk sort of strongly supported the idea. We recognize that we have partners who have some questions that they're asking about this initiative. But the Canadian perspective is we have to work hard, find answers to those questions, and move forward. And there are really two principal reasons for that. First of all, aggressor pays. Russia every single day is wrecking Ukraine. It's killing people, wrecking the country. I talked to you a minute ago about the targeting of medics, which I have to say, the Canadian and Polish soldiers I saw on Sunday, they were horrified by it. They were using, in their training, they were using an armored vehicle that had a red cross on it. And they said, in Ukraine, they have to cover up that red cross. Horrible. So Russia is doing a huge amount of damage. When I talk to Canadians, it's hard for me to say to Canadians that they should pay for that. I think it's Russia that should pay for that, and I think that's true for all of the allied countries that are supporting Ukraine in this effort. I think the second thing is we need to, now more than ever, show Putin that we are serious, that we are not flagging in our support for Ukraine, that we are confident that Ukraine will endure and that Ukraine will win and that Putin will lose. And so I think, strong action on the economic front as well as the military front is very timely right now. And the work on the assets of the Russian Central Bank would represent that and would show that, we quite literally have the assets to endure and keep on going.
Yeah. The farmer care deal, do you think it'll impact the budget number?
Okay, thank you for listening today, and some final thoughts. The people of New York are outraged as the schools are being closed and students are being moved into their moved from classroom to home kitchen tables so that they can continue their studies. Parents are outraged. They want to know when their kids will be allowed back to school, as they should be allowed. There should be some answers. One of the tough parts about government is distributing those answers to citizens and being completely transparent about what it is that you are actually doing. As some of us are moving into elections, we're seeing the primary start and the battle for Donald Trump and Joe Biden to see who will be heading back towards the presidential office. As we see that happening, there's a lot of tough decisions that we have to make as citizens. Who truly represents the job that we want done? and how we want it done. Who is going to support the issues and support the issues the way we want those issues supported? But we have to get out and vote. There are other votes starting to warm up in Canada, as there could be a possible election coming up in British Columbia and other provinces, and also a federal election in Canada, where we could see things really start to heat up between Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau. So the point is, when the election time comes, think hard, think again about who it is that truly represents what you want to see happen in our community. Don't just vote for the party, vote for what the people are really wanting to do. Look hard for that information and dig deep yourselves into what the promises are and what the promises truly mean. Thank you for listening again, and find the subscribe button wherever it may be for Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.